July 1955, a Soviet air show. American observers watch carefully as wave after wave of new jet bombers thunder overhead, counting each one that passes. They see 10 massive 4-engine jets in the first group, then another formation, 8 more of the same aircraft. These sleek, modern, menacing bombers represent a terrifying new threat, the Myasishchev M-4, NATO reporting name Bison. American intelligence tallies the count, 28 bombers. Clearly, the Soviets are mass-producing these strategic bombers capable of reaching the United States. What those observers didn't know was that they'd just been fooled by one of the most consequential tricks of the Cold War. Those 28 bombers, there were only 18. Soviet pilots had simply flown the first group in a loop, bringing 10 of them back around for a second pass. But the damage was done. The sighting sparked the bomber gap crisis, a panic that would influence American military spending for years and mask a darker truth. The Bison was a failure, born from desperation, designed under brutal pressure to meet an impossible deadline. This is the story of the Myasishchev M-4, a bomber that changed history without ever successfully doing what it was built for. To understand the M-4, we have to go back to 1950. Joseph Stalin was obsessed with matching American military power. The United States had demonstrated atomic weapons, possessed a fleet of B-29 and B-50 bombers, and was developing something even more threatening, the B-52 Stratofortress, an intercontinental jet bomber. Stalin demanded the Soviet Union build its own long-range strategic bomber immediately. The task fell to the Soviet Aviation Design Bureau. Andrei Tupolev proposed the Tu-95, a turboprop design, but Stalin wanted a jet, something modern, something that looked like it belonged in the jet age. But there was a problem. The Soviet Union's existing jet engine technology simply wasn't powerful enough for a heavy bomber. The engines available produced around 5,000 kilograms of thrust each. You need at least 4, probably more, to lift a strategic bomber with fuel, weapons, and enough range to reach America and return. The math simply didn't work, but Stalin didn't care about math. Enter Vladimir Mikhailovich Myasishchev. Myasishchev was one of Soviet aviation's brightest minds. In 1951, with Stalin desperate for a jet bomber, Myasishchev was given the assignment. There was a catch though. Myasishchev didn't have a design bureau. He didn't have a factory, he didn't even have staff, and Stalin wanted the aircraft flying in 18 months. What followed was one of the most compressed aircraft development programs in history. Myasishchev was given a factory, plant number 23 in Moscow, previously used for building other aircraft. Additionally, he had to recruit engineers, designers, and workers essentially from scratch, building an entire design bureau while simultaneously designing the aircraft itself. The requirements were brutal. Carry a 5,000 kilogram bomb load to targets in the United States and return to Soviet bases. That meant a range of at least 12,000 kilometers. Myasishchev's team worked around the clock. The design that emerged was actually quite elegant. A high-wing monoplane with 4 Mikulin AM-3 turbojets buried in the wing roots, bicycle-style landing gear, and swept wings. It looked unmistakably like a Soviet answer to the B-52. But there was a fatal flaw baked into the design from the start. Those AM-3 engines, each of which produced about 8,700 kilograms of thrust, which was not bad, but not enough. 4 of them gave the M-4 decent power, but the aircraft was heavy. Fully loaded with fuel and weapons, it tipped the scales at over 180,000 kilograms. The design team knew the range would be marginal, but they were designing for Stalin. And you didn't tell Stalin something wasn't possible. The prototype flew for the first time on January 20th, 1953. Just under 2 years after Myasishchev had been given the assignment, his bomber was in the air. It flew well, stable, responsive for its size, capable of over 900 kilometers per hour. The problem was the range. In testing, the M4 could reach about 9,500 kilometers, falling short of the required 12,000. 9,500 was enough to reach America, but it wasn't enough to get back. A strategic bomber that was essentially a one-way suicide mission wasn't much of a deterrent. Stalin died in March 1953, just 2 months after the M4's first flight, but the program continued under Khrushchev. The Soviet Union needed to project strength, and the M4 looked impressive, even if it couldn't actually do what it was supposed to do, so they decided to show it off. And we're back in July of 1955, where our story began at that Soviet air show. Soviet planners orchestrated a clever piece of theater. 18 M4 bombers, a significant portion of all flyable examples, took part in the demonstration. 10 flew over first, then circled around and flew over again, drawn by 8 more aircraft. American observers, counting from the ground, tallied 28 bombers. Intelligence reports went back to Washington, warning of a massive Soviet bomber production program. The CIA estimated 800 would be available by 1960. This triggered what became known as the bomber gap, the belief that the Soviet Union was outproducing the United States in strategic bombers and would soon have overwhelming nuclear strike capability. In reality, it wasn't quite like it seemed. By the time production ended in 1963, only 125 M4s and 3 Ms, which was an improved variant, had been built combined. The Soviet Union never had the bomber fleet America feared, but the bomber gap had real consequences. It influenced the 1956 presidential election, it justified massive increases in U.S. defense spending, and it accelerated American bomber and missile programs. Meanwhile, the actual M4, well, their crews were dealing with a very different reality. The range problem was never solved. Various modifications were tried, more efficient engines, additional fuel tanks, aerial refueling capability, but the M4 never achieved true intercontinental range with a combat load. Some M4s were stationed at Arctic bases closer to potential American targets, but even from there, a combat mission would be one way. Pilots were essentially being tasked to volunteer for suicide missions. Operational M4 units conducted constant training, but everyone knew the aircraft couldn't really fulfill its primary mission. It was a strategic bomber that couldn't reach strategic targets. By the late 1950s, it was clear the M4 program had failed as a strategic bomber. The Soviets tried to fix the range problem with an improved variant called the 3M, which first flew on March 27, 1956. It had more efficient engines and a real refueling capability, but still couldn't truly fulfill the intercontinental mission. Production stopped in 1963 with only the 125 aircraft being built. But the story actually doesn't end there. The Soviet Air Force had invested enormous resources into the M4. They weren't just gonna scrap them. If the Bison couldn't be a bomber, it could be something else entirely. And it became a tanker. The M4 was converted into the 3M tanker variant, and in this role, it was actually quite successful. Its large fuel capacity, previously a limitation because it left no room for combat range, was now an asset. The aircraft could carry massive amounts of fuel to transfer to other aircraft. These tankers extended the range of Soviet bombers and fighters well into the 1990s. Some M4 variants remained in service until 1994, 40 years after that famous airshow debut. Other M4s were converted for maritime reconnaissance, others for engine testbed work. Mizhev's design was a failure as a bomber, but it found useful life in supporting roles. As for Vladimir Mizhev himself, his story has a bittersweet ending. Despite the M4's shortcomings, he had successfully built a design bureau from nothing and produced a flyable strategic bomber under immense pressure. His bureau went on to design other aircraft, though sadly it was eventually dissolved in 1960 and merged into other organizations. Mizhev continued working in Soviet aviation until his death in 1978, having become one of the Soviet Union's respected aviation designers. The Mizhev M4 Bison never successfully completed its intended mission. It couldn't reach America with bombs and return home, and as a strategic bomber, it was obsolete almost from the moment it entered service. But it changed history anyways. That air show in July 1955 sparked the crisis that influenced Cold War policy for years. US President at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, actually agreed to the development of the U-2 spy plane to find out if the bomber gap was real or not. And the bomber gap also influenced elections in the 50s and 60s because it increased political pressure for higher defense spending, which was actually one of the arguments that John F. Kennedy used during his campaign for the presidency, and then, he later won. I find it interesting how this failed bomber was able to have such a butterfly effect on Cold War politics and policy. It's a reminder that in the fog of the Cold War, perception often mattered more than reality. The M-4 was more effective as a propaganda tool and a psychological weapon than it was ever as an actual bomber. The Bison wasn't the bomber Stalin wanted, but in the strange logic of the Cold War, maybe it was exactly the bomber the Soviet Union needed, which later backfired because then the US poured billions of dollars to try to mitigate this supposed bomber gap. Maybe that's a story for another day. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.